The title is the topic. Today I'm going to review the feminist frequency video Damsel in Distress Part 3. I already reviewed Part 1 and 2.
So if you haven't seen it yet, please check that one out before continuing to watch this one. So without further ado, let's jump right into the Damsel in Distress.
I agree full-heartedly.
In our previous 2 episodes on this topic, we've discussed how the damsel in distress trope has been, and continues to be, one of the most pervasive representations of women in gaming.
Episode 1 was a bizarre history lesson that bounced all over video game history. Episode 2 tried to frame the damsel in distress as worse than it is in its traditional use by combining different tropes,
showing up in hundreds of titles from old school classics to more modern day blockbusters.
By hundreds of games, you mean the 192 you referenced between all 3 episodes. All you did with your $158,000 is research less than 1% of every game ever made. That is lazy research.
Studied extensively. But what about the reverse? Are there games starring heroic women who must go on a quest to save a dude in distress?
Are you about to start your 3rd video on the damsel in distress by talking about lead female protagonist games?
Well, yes, they do exist. However, since female protagonists starring in their own games are already few and far between, adventures in which women work to save men in peril are extremely rare.
Mathematically speaking, you are correct, since there are less female protagonist games. So statistically speaking, there would be less women rescuing men, meaning these games must be real difficult to find.
Back in our first episode, I mentioned that Princess Peach is the star of exactly one platformer.
Yet you found one anyways.
Studied extensively.
With all your lazy research, when you wanted to find a game to suit your narrative, you actually got to work and did some actual research.
That game is called Super Princess Peach, and it was released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS handheld system.
You are about to exclude every other game she was playable in, so you can focus on aspects of this game you personally don't like.
The premise is a simple inversion of the standard franchise formula, with Bowser abducting Mario and Luigi, while Peach is tasked with their rescue this time.
One of your only criteria for talking about this game is she is a lead protagonist, as that is one of the only things that separates it from every other game she was playable in.
She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later.
What were all your complaints about her in Part 1?
The ill-fated princess, and she's kidnapped in 13 of them. Peach is kinda accidentally playable in this one. Sadly, Peach has never been a playable character again in the main franchise. The princess is still excluded from the action. Force her back into the damsel role again and again. And Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball. The 2 men are tossing her back and forth over the course of the main series, each trying to keep and take possession of the damsel ball.
And what other games was she playable in? And leading in with this game, when you complain about her treatment in Part 1, is taking your flagship character for the damsel in distress.
Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress.
And talking about how she's been treated better than most damsels.
Studied extensively. So finally, after being kidnapped in 13 separate Super Mario games, Peach gets to be the hero for once.
A playable damsel? A protagonist female? This is a move on Nintendo's part in the direction you want developers to go, according to your philosophy.
It'd be great to finally see Zelda, Sheik, and Tetra as the protagonists of their own games.
It may not be Zelda, but it is a playable damsel.
And not just mobile DS games, I'm talking full-on console adventures.
You exclude mobile DS games from discussion when it comes to Princess Zelda and leave Princess Peach out of that segment because one of the only games where a lead Nintendo damsel, being Princess Peach and Zelda, is playable in a lead role just happens to be on the Nintendo DS.
It'd be great to finally see Zelda, Sheik, and Tetra as the protagonists of their own games. And not just mobile DS games. That game is called Super Princess Peach, and it was released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS handheld system.
You intentionally word your arguments so any potential counter-argument can't be used.
And not just mobile DS games, and it was released in 2006 for the Nintendo DS handheld system.
Since I am critiquing your work, I am now a critic myself, and your rules do not apply to me. So I don't care if you don't want to count DS games or not. And the fact you bring up several games from portable systems means they are fair game. I refuse to play by your ridiculous set of rules.
But don't get too excited, because everything else about the game ends up in a train wreck of gendered stereotypes.
Nintendo at least attempts to break the mold, yet you are about to attack them for attempting to do what most developers don't do, and that is to make a damsel the star of a game.
Nintendo introduced a new gameplay mechanic for Peach where the player can choose from 4 special powers, or vibes as they're called. And you know what those powers are? Her mood swings. That's right, Peach's powers are her out-of-control, frantic female emotions.
Frantic female emotions. Let's see where this goes.
She can throw a temper tantrum and rage her enemies to death, or bawl her eyes out and wash the bad guys away with tears. Essentially, Nintendo has turned a PMS joke into their core gameplay mechanic.
A PMS joke? You said there were 4 powers, but only mentioned 2. What were the other 2 powers? Joy. Peach becomes very happy and gains the ability to float. It sounds to me like you left out something positive about her emotions, only to focus on the negative and say it is a PMS joke.
Essentially, Nintendo has turned a PMS joke into their core gameplay mechanic.
I guess you could call it bloating, but why would it be called joy and make her happy? I heard bloating sucks. Calm. Peach becomes calm, restoring HP while draining the vibe gauge. I can't fathom how you concluded her powers are based on a PMS joke, as one of her powers include healing as opposed to bleeding.
Essentially, Nintendo has turned a PMS joke into their core gameplay mechanic.
Do you have a quote from anyone at Nintendo saying it was intended to be a PMS joke, or are you making the implication to shame them?
As if that weren't bad enough, Peach is not even featured in any of the game's narrative cutscenes. Instead, they all focus on the backstory of her parasol, who it turns out is really a cursed boy named Perry.
After each boss battle, Peach and Perry rest before continuing on to the next area in Vibe Island. During each rest period, Perry has a reoccurring dream that seems to reveal more about his past. Perry's story shows that he was originally a human boy, but was taken from his grandfather by a pair of evildoers who then trapped him in an umbrella form. The story itself is completely different from Peach's main task in her adventure. The gameplay is focused on Peach's task, the cutscenes explain the Umbrella's story. And even if you can demonstrate it to be a negative the way they did that, there are positives you fail to cover. What about music, level design, gameplay? Is it actually fun to play? The way you are covering this game, no one can tell if it has any positive merits to it.
So while it's definitely nice to see Peach starring in her own adventure, the Dude in Distress role reversal premise here feels like it's just intended as a lighthearted joke or niche market novelty.
Feels like a lighthearted joke. So you are telling us how it feels to you on a personal level. Yet despite the game's overall positive reviews, you focus on what you claim to be negatives.
But please keep in mind that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy a piece of media while also being critical of its more pernicious aspects.
All you do is criticize games you don't like and praise ones you do like, overlooking positives and negatives as you see fit.
Similar gender inversion plot devices have been used in a handful of games over the years, including Balloon Kid for the original Game Boy, part of the plot of Kaya Dark Lineage, and Primal in one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil.
4 games that fit that narrative. What did you say earlier?
Adventures in which women work to save men in peril are extremely rare. Super Princess Peach, Balloon Kid, Kaya Dark Lineage, Primal, and Beyond Good and Evil.
5 games that fit that narrative that is an extremely rare theme. And it was part of a plot in Kaya Dark Lineage and a portion of Beyond Good and Evil.
Part of the plot of Kaya Dark Lineage revolves around finding Kaya's half-brother Frank, Beyond Good and Evil. Jade's sidekick Uncle Paige is captured and held prisoner for a portion of the adventure.
Meaning, by your definition, anytime a female in a lead role has to rescue a male character, that is a role reversal. You just opened one hell of a Pandora's box, as anyone can simply find a female protagonist game where they rescue male characters.
Studied extensively.
I'm not even going to bother looking that one up. I am curious, though, just how many female protagonist games there are where they rescue men.
It's probably not a coincidence that the majority of these titles were produced and released during the run of the popular TV show Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
It's probably not a coincidence that you intentionally pick games released in that time frame to make that talking point. You said probably not a coincidence.
It's probably not a coincidence.
Is there a link? Or is it a coincidence? And there are several female protagonist games that predate Buffy the series,
which led the girl power trend in mass media entertainment that briefly took hold in the late 1990s and early 2000s. You might remember Charmed, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or the British pop sensations the Spice Girls, who, in many ways, exemplified the phenomenon.
What do television shows and female singers have to do with gaming? Isn't this a waste of the resources you were supposed to spend researching video games? As far as girl power trends, Bionic Woman 1976, Wonder Woman 1975, Charlie's Angels 1976. There have been girl power trends on television that predate most video games. These trends may fluctuate, but they've been around for decades. How does this correlate with video games?
Over the past decade, however, games featuring the dude in distress gender inversion have been few and far between.
Which must make them tough to find, since it is supposed to be extremely rare.
Adventures in which women work to save men in peril are extremely rare.
So finding one must be difficult.
One rare example is the 2007 indie game Aquaria.
Yet you found one anyways.
Studied extensively, in which Naja travels through an underwater world, making sushi, learning about her past, and must eventually rescue her love interest Lee.
Nice little summary of that game. I like the part where you left out any criticism, since you seem to actually like this game. Too bad Super Princess Peach didn't receive similar treatment, given these games both got fairly similar scores.
So what is the difference between traditional narratives that place female characters in powerless positions, and stories in which a male character requires rescuing by a woman?
Why did you refer to the female as being powerless, but the male just merely requiring rescuing?
Female characters in powerless positions, a male character requires rescuing by a woman.
With that wording, you make the predicament sound worse for the woman than it is for the man. In both cases, they could be considered powerless and require rescuing.
On the surface, the dude in distress and the damsel in distress may appear similar.
They are similar. You are just wording it so they sound different.
However, they're not actually equivalent. To understand why they're different, we need to examine the broader historical and cultural implications of the two plot devices.
There are implications if a man requires rescuing from a woman, and even if you want to go down this road, you still have not proven the negative effects of these games in a real-world context.
First, there's been no shortage of men in leading or heroic roles in video games, or in any other creative medium for that matter.
In the leading role? What about games where gender is an optional choice? One thing Anita isn't mentioning is games, unlike traditional forms of media, can allow for optional choices provided they are programmed into the game.
In fact, one recent study found that only about 4% of modern titles are exclusively designed around a woman in the leading role.
I couldn't find the study Anita is referencing, but I did find this on a wiki page. In a sample of 669 action shooter and role-playing games selected by EEDAR in 2012, only 4% had an exclusively female protagonist, and 45% provided an option of selecting one. I'm not sure if this is the study Anita referenced, but it did say 4% female protagonists.
In fact, one recent study found that only about 4% of modern titles are exclusively designed around a woman in the leading role.
Maybe men are dominant in the leading roles, but when gender is optional, at least according to this resource, that is 45% of games. That far exceeds what you see in traditional media when it comes to choice in gender.
Since men are still largely the default for protagonists, the rare dude in distress plotline does not add to any long-standing gender tradition in storytelling.
This is what Anita said at the end of the video.
Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
Having women rescue men disrupts the established pattern, breaks the cycle, and creates new gender paradigms. Yet, as we just saw, Anita is nitpicking the very things she said should happen in video games.
Since men are still largely the default for protagonists, the rare dude in distress plotline does not add to any long-standing gender tradition in storytelling.
You just can't win with Anita. She will always craft her words to nitpick things, even if she contradicts herself in the same video.
Studied extensively. Second, and perhaps more importantly, damsel female characters tend to reinforce pre-existing regressive notions about women as a group being weak or in need of protection because of their gender. While stories with the occasional helpless male character do not perpetuate anything negative about men as a group, since there's no long-standing stereotype of men being weak or incapable because of their gender.
Women are statistically the victim more often, as you said in part 2.
Serious, real-life epidemic of violence against women. Every 9 seconds, a woman is assaulted or beaten in the United States. More than 3 women are murdered by their boyfriends, husbands, or ex-partners every single day. People of all genders tend to buy into the myth that women are the ones to blame for the violence men perpetrate against them. Abusive men consistently state that their female targets deserved it, wanted it, or were asking for it.
It does not matter how the damsel in distress portrays women, and it does not matter what I say. You already proved that women are in need of more protection because of their gender. I don't even have to leave your own body of work to demonstrate that. You said it for me.
To help illustrate this point, let's quickly take a look at the indie game Spelunky. Originally released in 2009, the game included a stereotypical damsel in distress as a gameplay mechanic, whose rescue rewarded the player with bonus health. The 2012 HD remake of the game for Xbox Live again features the stock character Damsel, complete with newly upgraded boob jiggle.
Why point out the boob jiggle? What bearing does that have on the original point you were supposed to be making?
However, this time an option was added to the menu that allows players to select a replacement for the default woman in peril, by switching to either a Chippendale-style hunk or a dog instead.
Chippendale-style hunk? The boob jiggle is an issue, but this is perfectly acceptable.
Boob jiggle, Chippendale-style hunk.
I don't have any issues with either one, but you seem to take issue with only the ones you want to take issue with.
Setting aside the fact that if a female character is easily interchangeable with a dog, then it's probably a pretty good indication that something is wrong.
The male character is also interchangeable. By your logic, the man is also equated to a dog. You have this habit of crafting your words in a way to shame developers, even though all they did was give players more choices. Maybe there are people who would rather rescue a dog.
Merely providing an optional gender swap is not a quick and easy fix, especially where stock character-style damsels are concerned. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern.
An interchangeable damsel challenges the tradition, yet you are still complaining.
The two may appear the same, but they don't mean the same thing in our culture. This is still a problem, while this is not. Again, because one reinforces pre-existing stereotypes about women, while the other does not reinforce any pre-existing stereotypes about men.
I guess Anita missed Magic Mike while she was working hard on her videos, as that look is a stereotype of male strippers.
In recent years, we've also seen a number of news stories about fans who've taken it upon themselves to switch the gender roles in classic-era games by manipulating the code. There's Mike Micah's Donkey Kong hack, in which Pauline works to save Jumpman, Mike Hoy's gender-bending version of Wind Waker, and Kenna Warzinski's Zelda starring Zelda, which transforms the princess into the protagonist.
If players can do this already, why should developers feel obligated to change their vision for the games they create with their time and their money?
This practice of gender hacking game ROMs has actually been around for decades, offering enterprising players the chance to play as a female version of Mega Man, or as Princess Peach rescuing Mario with her mermaid power.
So this isn't a recent development? It's been around for decades?
And thanks to the internet, game mods and emulators are now much more widely accessible.
Meaning that asking developers to make these changes is more and more pointless, as gamers are getting more and more opportunities to make and experience the changes for themselves.
Gender hacks like these illustrate how female characters taking on the role of heroic rescuer can directly challenge the status quo and interrupt the established male-dominated pattern in gaming.
You already showed us several games earlier that fall into that criteria of challenging the status quo.
Super Princess Peach, Balloon Kid, Kaya Dark Lineage, Primal, Beyond Good and Evil.
And then told us about gender hacks that challenge the established male pattern in gaming.
Studied extensively.
When you actually do put effort into studying, all you manage to do is challenge your own claims. This is an issue that needs dealt with.
That said, I don't necessarily think equal opportunity damseling is the answer.
What I've been saying since my first review is all Anita is doing is arguing to get rid of the trope altogether. She just showed us examples of where games reverse the role and where players can choose to reverse the role themselves, yet she is about to argue how this is still not a solution.
Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
You just showed games that challenge the tradition, yet it is not a solution. In other words, no solution is suitable other than to get rid of the damsel in distress altogether.
Simply reversing the gender roles of a problematic convention so that more men are damseled in more games is not the best long-term solution, even if the practice might be subversive in the short term to help demonstrate a very real gender disparity in the medium.
It could be a long-term solution if more developers decided to go this route, but it just isn't good enough, because even if the role is reversed, there will still be female damsels in distress in some games. With Anita's logic, this will always be unacceptable.
Ultimately, we need to think beyond the cliché altogether.
In other words, get rid of it altogether.
Over the past several years, we've seen an explosion of independent development, with many new titles drawing inspiration from classic-era games. This is an exciting and vibrant trend with enormous potential for innovation.
It does have potential for innovation, but the reason it is rare to see true innovation is because a lot of it has already been done. Developers have figured out what works and what doesn't, and this is a large part of why these independent developers draw inspiration from classic games, because they know what works.
But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling?
You just said they draw inspiration from classic games, many of which have the damsel in distress, just to turn around and ask if they break the mold.
With many new titles drawing inspiration from classic-era games. But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling?
I think it is safe to say there will probably be some degree of damseling, making the implication it wouldn't exist a pointless statement.
Studied extensively. While we see the trope reproduced in indie, mobile, or retro-inspired games like Gish, Castle Crashers, Aversion, Machinarium, Super Meat Boy, Robot, I Must Run, Flying Hamster, Rochard, Sideway New York, Zack Zero, Bean's Quest, Hotline Miami, Labyrinth Legends, Sang Fuad Tales of Werewolves, Gunman Clive, DLC Quest, The Other Brothers, Fist Puncher, Fight Back, Tiny Thief, Nightmare Tower, and Guacamelee.
So it exists in 23 games.
Not to mention the myriad of other mobile games for tablets and smartphones which recycle the excuse plot ad nauseum.
Assuming the 50 tiles you show here represent 50 games, adding to the 23 you just showed, that is 73 games between 2004 and 2013. 73 games in a 9-year time frame average about 8 games per year.
Ad nauseum.
I would hardly call an average of 8 games per year ad nauseum. If I look at some game systems released in that time frame, I get over 5,000 games. If I looked at every indie, mobile, or retro-inspired games, as well as a myriad of other mobile games for tablets and smartphones, I doubt I'd find that this trope is used ad nauseum if I looked at every game that fit those criteria.
Far from being a thing of the past, the trope now appears to be more popular than ever.
Far from being a thing of the past? You already established between part 1 and 2, it never went away.
Studied extensively, and since mobile, indie, and retro-inspired games are built upon a legacy of inequality in the medium, the new wave of 80s and 90s nostalgia has brought with it the resurrection of the worst of the old-school damsel in distress stereotype.
What do you mean the worst? How are you establishing when it is ever good? All you've done is attack the trope in every way, shape, and form, and explain with cleverly crafted language that the only solution is to get rid of it altogether.
Indeed, many of these new titles essentially function as love letters to the trope, as a way of paying homage to classic games of years gone by.
What is wrong with paying homage to games you grow up on? Is it the game they are paying homage to, or the trope? Maybe they just liked the game as a child.
This approach is no doubt intended as a kind of shallow meta-commentary on the tired old convention, suggesting developers are only employing the trope because the games that inspired them did so. But this type of ironic self-awareness does not challenge or disrupt what the damsel in distress trope says about the role of women in such narratives.
I have a self-awareness of how pop culture critics like you act when you criticize games and developers. You carefully craft your language to shame developers and attack games you don't like.
Fat Princess, Horde, Dokuro, and the aforementioned Spelunky all include patronizing damsel jokes built right into the gameplay mechanics, which turn damseled characters into very literal objects, instead of just narrative ones.
in 4 games.
In Spelunky, the damsel can be knocked out, picked up, carried around, and thrown at enemies, before rewarding the player with an extra heart via a smooch of victory, if you manage to get her limp, unconscious body to the end of each level while still alive, that is.
I'm going to be honest here. I'd never heard of Spelunky till I watched Damsel in Distress Part 3. The first time I saw the damsel being thrown around in Spelunky, I started laughing my ass off. I honestly think some of these games are intended to be funny, as some of this stuff is too silly to be taken seriously. And being that Spelunky now has replacements for the woman in peril,
this time an option was added to the menu that allows players to select a replacement for the default woman in peril.
I assume you could switch out the woman for the man if it bugs you that much.
Fat Princess is essentially one big game of capture the flag, but with princesses instead of flags. Teams of up to 16 players work together to rescue their kidnapped princess from the enemy's castle, before the opposing team can save their own princess from your castle. Even worse is the other game mechanic, which allows players to feed their captive princesses slices of cake. The more she eats, the heavier she gets, and the more difficult for the other team to carry her back to their own base. Her voice also becomes deeper and less traditionally feminine sounding the bigger you make her.
Much like Spelunky, I'd never heard of Fat Princess. I started laughing my ass off at the game mechanics. If we can't enjoy these games due to mechanics that could potentially offend someone other than us, what that means is we are supposed to only accept games that you consider acceptable. You are being very selfish in your criticism of these games.
Players are meant to find all of this hilarious, of course, so the entire premise of this game is basically built around one big sexist fat joke.
I'd hardly call fat characters as being a sexist joke unless you are referencing that she is a damsel and fat. Then again, you said that the damsel combined with other tropes does not represent the damsel in distress trope by itself.
As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
So being fat is not representative of the damsel in distress trope by itself.
Sometimes this type of self-referential humor is referred to as ironic sexism.
You can select a man in Spelunky, and being fat is not a sexist issue, as both men and women can be fat.
It's the I know, that you know, that I know, this is sexist, wherein the underlying assumption on the part of media makers seems to be that as long as the sexism is overt, obvious, or over the top, then it somehow loses its cultural power and is suddenly no longer a problem.
I know that you know that I know that you never proved these games have a negative effect on people.
Ironic sexism is dependent upon the false assumption that people no longer really hold retrograde sexist beliefs, and therefore the very idea of sexism is now just a hilarious joke. But nothing could be further from the truth.
No one said sexism is a hilarious joke. You are wording it in such a way that when the obscure game comes out with these themes, that the developers are somehow sexist, or at least unaware of the alleged sexism they perpetuate.
Words like parody and satire are often thrown around to describe or defend these comedic depictions of yet more helpless female characters.
It is just parody and satire since it exists in such few games. And these oddball examples you found, such as Spelunky and Fat Princess, are not the norm with the damsel in distress.
But a simple wink and nod to the audience acknowledging a sexist trope, while actively reproducing that trope, does not automatically grant a free pass to continue exploiting the trope.
What do you mean a free pass? Why are you the moral authority on whether these are acceptable or not? All you are is one pop culture critic who raised $158,000 to talk about less than 1% of every game ever made. Most of your videos are not founded on facts, they are founded on your opinions. Even if these are just suggestions on your part, they aren't very well researched. They are just your opinions.
More often than not, the ironic humor is just an excuse used by developers as a way to try and have their cake and eat it too, so to speak.
I couldn't resist with the cake line.
They want to use the trope, but not be held accountable for the inherent negative gender implications that come with it.
Why should they be held accountable? You never proved these games have negative effects on people. You are not an authority figure. You are just a pop culture critic.
Incidentally, a few games might have the option to play as a woman in multi-character lineups, but just because you could choose to play her does not mean that this is then magically okay.
A pop culture critic telling us what is or is not okay. You are just a pop culture critic. Nothing more, nothing less.
A handful of other games attempt to get away with reproducing the damsel in distress by offering the ability to unlock and play as the damsel character.
Let me replay that last clip again with a slight edit.
A handful of other games attempt to get away with reproducing the damsel in distress. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern by offering the ability to unlock, break the cycle, and play as the damsel character, and create new gender paradigms.
Anita's thought process on this video is so lazy that I can just re-edit it so she counters her own arguments within the same video.
Studied extensively, but typically only after the game has first been completed with the default male hero. However, these types of token role reversals do absolutely nothing to diminish the issues inherent in using the trope in the first place.
Despite the fact developers are now making the damsel playable in some form, she still has issues with it. Once again, just get rid of it altogether, because no incarnation of the damsel in distress will ever be satisfactory to Anita.
Now, of course, some of the games we've been discussing may also be well made or super fun to play, aside from their regressive gender representations.
At the very end of her assault on these games, due to one storytelling element, being the damsel in distress, she admits they may be fun to play. You did the same thing toward the end of part 1.
Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value.
You said this at the beginning of your video.
But please keep in mind that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy a piece of media
you choose not to enjoy despite your acknowledgement they may be fun.
Now, of course, some of the games we've been discussing may also be well made or super fun to play,
only to turn around and do this to games you acknowledge may be fun,
while also being critical of its more pernicious aspects.
As a pop culture critic, you should be able to look at the games as a whole and make a fair assessment on whether the game is acceptable or not based on all factors. The sad part is that with all your YouTube subscribers, Twitter followers, and the fact you are a curator on Steam, you will never guide your audience to games you acknowledge may be fun to play. All because of the damsel in distress.
But the widespread resurrection of old-school style damsels in distress is still an unfortunate trend because it's absolutely possible to create indie games that appeal to the retro feeling of the 8-bit or 16-bit era without regurgitating the helpless woman as plot device.
I want to preface the last section with something she just said a few minutes ago.
But have games produced outside of the mainstream studio system managed to break the gender mold and avoid damseling? Because it's absolutely possible to create indie games that appeal to the retro feeling of the 8-bit or 16-bit era without regurgitating the helpless woman as plot device.
To answer your question, Anita, games produced outside the mainstream studio system manage to break the gender mold and avoid damseling.
There are other ways to pay homage or shout out to the past through art style, gameplay mechanics, or level design.
What if someone wants to rescue a damsel? Some of the greatest stories ever told involve a guy saving a girl. Some of the greatest games ever made were inspired by the damsel in distress trope.
Miyamoto created his own characters to fill the void, heavily influenced by the movie King Kong.
If we start to restrict the creativity of developers by telling them these tropes are wrong to use, even if there is nothing inherently wrong with them, we risk having a future of gaming where children won't have the fond memories of games that we had as children.
Now, I grew up on Nintendo. I've been a fan of the Mario and Zelda franchises for most of my life, and they'll always have a special place in my heart, as I'm sure is true for a great number of gamers out there.
You and me both grew up on Nintendo, and the Zelda and Mario franchises both have a special place in our hearts. Unlike you, I would never criticize Nintendo over something they did that is not inherently wrong.
Games like Sword and Sorcery, Where's My Heart, and Fez are all beautiful and creative retro-style games that appeal to a sense of nostalgia without replicating or falling back on the damsel in distress.
Why don't you just play those games instead if damseling bothers you so much?
Of course, games attempting to make light of the damsel in distress are not limited to recent indie games, but are part of a long tradition in the medium that continues today with popular mainstream titles like Rayman Origins and Ghost Trick Phantom Detective for the Nintendo DS. Since comedy in and of itself is often confused for subversion or deconstruction in our current media culture, let's take a moment to unpack the various ways humor has been employed in relation to the trope.
Comedy has made fun of everything in history. You are so determined to get rid of the damsel in distress that we can't even make fun of it, because making fun of it would involve portraying it in games. In other words, just get rid of it altogether.
In the 1994 platformer Earthworm Jim, the woman in peril waiting at the end of the game is officially called Princess What's-Her-Name, a reference meant to humorously acknowledge the fact that many damseled characters in classic-era titles were so unimportant that they either remained unnamed or were otherwise entirely unmemorable.
You just defined it as a joke. I don't see any issue with that.
So, the developers of Earthworm Jim noticed that sexist trend, thought it was hilarious, and proceeded to make another game in which a woman is completely unimportant.
The developers noticed that sexist trend and thought it was hilarious. Are you implying they are sexist with that wording?
To add insult to injury, when Jim finally reaches Princess What's-Her-Name and is preparing to collect his reward, she is randomly killed by a falling cow. The bad ending of the indie game Aversion features a similar joke.
You are back to calling it a joke.
When the hero finally reaches the princess, she turns into a monster and eats you alive. A similar endgame punchline can also be found in Castle Crashers. After you've saved the fourth princess and then fought and killed your friends over who gets to claim her, it turns out that she has a horrible clown face. In each case, the joke derives from the fact that after completing the long and perilous journey to save his woman, our hero is hilariously cheated out of his rightful reward. In other words, the comedy comes at the damsel's expense.
You just said the joke is on the hero.
Our hero is hilariously cheated out of his rightful reward.
The comedy comes at the expense of the player because you spend an entire game as a player trying to rescue a damsel just to have a joke played on you by the developers. With your line of thinking, not even the developers can have fun with their games.
These titles may be attempting to make fun of gaming conventions like the heroic rescue or the smooch of victory, but they don't fundamentally change, challenge, or subvert the damsel in distress trope itself. The damseled women remain as disempowered as ever.
Once again, get rid of it altogether.
Now, some will no doubt contend that jokes have no cultural power or significance and should just not be taken seriously. This is nothing new. Making light of and dismissing gender issues is a sad, time-honored tradition. But I would argue that this reaction fundamentally misunderstands how humor functions as one of the primary means by which the culture of sexism is maintained and perpetuated.
I want to play one part out of everything she just said.
But I would argue,
when she says, "but I would argue," she is trying to tell you to interpret humor the way she interprets it.
That this reaction fundamentally misunderstands how humor functions as one of the primary means by which the culture of sexism is maintained and perpetuated.
Anita Sarkeesian sat down in front of a television with Jonathan McIntosh for several hours learning his line of thinking. I've read enough of Jonathan McIntosh's tweets on Twitter to know I don't agree with his line of thinking. Is that Anita's interpretation, or did someone else teach her their interpretation?
Mass media entertainment doesn't just reflect our culture, it also works to create it. There's often a lot of hostility towards watching TV, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true. It also works to create it, like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains, but I don't think that's true. It also works to create it, but I don't think that's true.
There's often a lot of hostility towards playing games like it's some big, bad, horrible thing that's going to warp our brains, but I just don't think that's true.
Sexist jokes in particular serve as a form of cultural permission, which help entrench toxic pre-existing attitudes and opinions. Like it's this big, bad, horrible thing that's gonna warp our brains. Of course, humor can also be a powerful tool with which to challenge or break down harmful gender myths, but that is much harder to pull off and must be done with careful intentionality.
It is only hard to pull off because you have made a checklist of what is or is not acceptable.
There is a clear difference between sexist parody and parody of sexism. Sexist parody encourages the players to mock and trivialize gender issues, while parody of sexism disrupts the status quo and undermines regressive gender conventions.
And the checklist becomes that much bigger.
Studied extensively. So, for instance, when wannabe pirate Guybrush Threepwood finally reaches the kidnapped Elaine Marley in the 1990 adventure game The Secret of Monkey Island, she already has a plan to escape and he ruins it with his attempt to rescue her. The joke ends up being directed at the protagonist, rather than making fun of the damseled woman.
So making fun of the protagonist is fine, but the damsel is off limits.
There's been much discussion over the ultimate meaning of the 2008 indie hit Braid, but it's notable as an example of a more dramatic game that plays with the trope. Although the narrative is somewhat abstract, it eventually becomes clear that the damsel has actually been trying to get away from the protagonist the whole time. Both of these games offer some interesting commentary on the heroic rescue formula. Monkey Island asks, what if the damsel is perfectly capable of orchestrating her own escape, and attempts to rescue her just make things worse? It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern. Braid asks, in part, what if by trying to save the damsel, it actually makes you the villain? Break the cycle and create new gender paradigms.
Braid disrupts the established pattern.
While these types of games are a refreshing departure from the standard formula, and something I generally like to see more of,
So they make games that fall into that criteria that you consider acceptable.
the focus is still squarely on the male characters, and so, at their core, these games are really deconstructing the player's assumptions about the traditional hero archetype.
Even though you'd like to see it more, the focus is on the male characters. Once again, get rid of the trope altogether. There should never be a damsel in distress ever again.
A true subversion of the trope would need to star the damsel as the main playable character. It would have to be her story. Sadly, there are very few games that really explore this idea, so as a way to illustrate how a deconstruction could work, let's try a thought experiment to see if we can create a hypothetical game concept of our own.
I'm willing to bet that this hypothetical game concept will find a way to get rid of the trope.
Like many fairy tales, this story begins once upon a time with the kidnapping of a princess.
Now let me stop right here. If we are to truly see if this improves the trope or gets rid of it altogether, let's see how Anita defines a protagonist story by cross-referencing her game concept with what she said in part 1.
Let's compare the damsel to the archetypal hero myth, in which a typically male character may occasionally also be harmed, incapacitated, or briefly imprisoned at some point during their journey.
Like many fairy tales, this story begins once upon a time with the kidnapping of a princess.
In these situations, the character relies on their intelligence, cunning, and skill to engineer their own escape.
Eventually, however, she grows tired of the damseling and decides it's high time she saves herself.
Or, just punching a hole in the prison wall works too. The point is, they're ultimately able to gain back their own freedom. In fact, that process of overcoming the ordeal is an important step in the protagonist's transformation into a heroic figure.
Of course, if she's going to be the protagonist of this particular adventure, she's going to need to acquire a slightly more practical outfit.
Anita's only solution, her only suggestion, the only possible way Anita Sarkeesian would ever accept the damsel in distress would be to make it a protagonist game as she herself defined in part 1. Even the name of the game, The Last Princess, is that also supposed to represent the last damsel in distress?
After her daring escape, she navigates the forbidding forest, leveling up her skills along the way.
Sounds like a generic game. Nothing innovative or new. Just the same old recycled game concepts.
Upon reaching her kingdom, she discovers the inevitable yet unexpected plot twist. The royal council has usurped power and were responsible for her kidnapping.
Still generic.
Branded a traitor and outlaw in her own land, she unlocks new disguises and stealth abilities to infiltrate the city walls.
Still generic.
She makes her way through the final castle to confront the villainous council and abolish the monarchy forever.
Still generic.
A story idea like this one would work to actively subvert traditional narrative expectations. The princess is placed in a perilous situation, but instead of being made into the goal for a male protagonist, she uses her intelligence, creativity, wit, and strength to engineer her own escape, and then become the star of her own adventure.
The story is a good start, but it's generic. Nothing really grabs me. You also talked about gameplay mechanics like leveling up skills and acquiring disguises and stealth abilities. What about level design? Will there be any puzzle solving? What kind of bosses will the game have? What patterns will the enemies and bosses have? What game would it be comparable to? Will it even be fun to play? All I have with this game concept are more questions than answers.
Now, I'm certainly not arguing that all stories must include completely fearless, hyper-individualistic, heroic women who pull themselves up by their bootstraps and never need anything from anyone. Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
Less than 1% of every game made is pretty much occasionally needing assistance.
In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil. In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil. In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil. In one of my favorite games of all time, Beyond Good and Evil.
I guess it is acceptable if it is one of your favorite games of all time. However, a traditional damsel in distress story would have the man rescuing the woman at the end,
from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
But with Anita's definition,
all that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness.
Anything is a damsel in distress. Even if the princess is only kidnapped at the beginning and instruments her own escape, she is a damsel in distress according to Anita.
With the kidnapping of a princess. Eventually, however, she grows tired of the damseling and decides it's high time she saves herself.
I guess one could make the argument she only wants the traditional damsel in distress to disappear. But for those of us who had fond memories of these games, I'd still like to see games where men rescue the damsel at the end so other children around the world could grow up with these fond memories.
Now, I grew up on Nintendo. I've been a fan of the Mario and Zelda franchises for most of my life, and they'll always have a special place in my heart, as I'm sure is true for a great number of gamers out there.
There is nothing inherently wrong with a child wanting to rescue the princess. One of the oldest jokes in gaming history is our princess is in another castle. If developers were to confine their creativity to a checklist of what one pop culture critic considers acceptable, gaming would become one of the most boring forms of entertainment, as developers could potentially lose any desire to make the games they want to make. Who wants to be told not to express their creativity?
The human impulse to help others in need is certainly not a negative thing. It only becomes a problem when acts of altruism are repeatedly presented in heavily gendered ways that are bound up in harmful myths about women as perpetual victims and men as paternalistic saviors.
In less than 1% of every game ever made.
In fact, cooperation and mutual aid are concepts that hold an enormous amount of gaming potential. True co-op games, MMOs, and some RPGs offer gameplay possibilities that, if done right, can facilitate a mutual aid-style adventure involving people of all genders cooperating. Whereas My Heart and Thomas Was Alone both employ innovative examples of mutual aid by having a single player control multiple characters working together towards a common goal.
Then go play those games!
As we've established, the damsel in distress is part of a long tradition of mythological narratives dating back through the ages.
If the damsel in distress has been around for that long, why should we get rid of it now? Maybe I want to rescue the damsel in a story that I play. You do understand that the gaming industry is not all about Anita Keesian. The gaming industry is about millions of people around the world that play these games. You are not the moral authority on what is right or wrong for video games. Maybe they make these games because they appeal to a human nature you just defined as acceptable.
Of course, there is absolutely nothing wrong with offering or occasionally needing assistance.
If that is the case, why do you take issue with a trope that appears in less than 1% of every game made?
But those historic roots are no excuse for the continued use of a trope that perpetuates regressive and patronizing myths about women.
The only one who is saying that is you. You never proved these games have a negative effect on people. It is people like you that define it as an issue and tell other people to have a problem with it. People are being educated to have issues with a plot device that would never bother them under normal circumstances.
It's been 100 years since a woman was first tied to the railroad tracks in this 1913 Keystone Cops short. And it's been over 3 decades since the hit arcade game Donkey Kong helped entrench the damsel in distress as a default motivation for male heroes in video games as a medium.
The default motivation for male heroes in many video games is to defeat the alien, robot, or bad guy at the end of the game. The damsel in distress exists in some of these games. And even if the damsel in distress is the motivation in those games, it is less than 1% of every game ever made, according to your numbers.
Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
I've been saying this since I started reviewing the damsel in distress videos. All Anita wants to do is see the damsel in distress disappear altogether. She has attacked, criticized, and dismissed every incarnation of the trope. And she has worded her language in such a way that she can claim she doesn't want to get rid of it.
All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
Like many fairy tales, this story begins once upon a time with the kidnapping of a princess. Eventually, however, she grows tired of the damseling and decides it's high time she saves herself.
But that is her definition. Anita Sarkeesian took the traditional storytelling element,
So, without further ado, let's jump right into the damsel in distress.
redefined it with carefully crafted language,
All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness, from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero.
spent 3 videos educating people on her definitions, and now wants developers to stop using it.
But those historic roots are no excuse for the continued use of a trope that perpetuates regressive and patronizing myths about women.
The more I review these videos, the more sorry I feel for game developers who are being shamed for doing nothing wrong.
Yet, here we are, still seeing the same old cliche trotted out again and again. It's long past time to disrupt the established pattern, break the cycle, and create new gender paradigms.
All you are doing is arguing to get rid of the damsel in distress altogether. You showed several games and some examples that fall into that criteria. Your third video was in large part a rebuttal to your premise that this issue needs to be dealt with. How you managed to pull that one off is beyond me. If you like this video, I have a playlist tackling Anita Sarkeesian and her work, and encourage you to check it out. It also includes reviews of her Tropes vs. Women in Video Games series.
I get a lot of support from people who really like my videos, and they've even been used as educational tools in classrooms. Educational tools.
I leave my audience with one question.
Oh, did I win?